different places, many races living in the sun.
According to advertisers like coffee maker Greg's, 1970s New Zealand was a harmonious utopia.
And so, 150 years on, the great-great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria arrived in Waitangi, escorted by 1,000 warriors in these magnificent long war canoes.
And while the country has long been lauded for its integration and tolerance, not everyone shared such a rosy view.
In the background, the shouts and yells of Maori activist protesters as they tried to get closer to the Queen.
Colonised by the British in the 19th century, the indigenous population, the Maori, would lose 97% of their land, often through deception and violence. Maori have been disadvantaged ever since.
We have horrific health statistics, education statistics. We are 17% of the population, but make up 52% of the prison population. Something had to be done to mitigate the horrific atrocities that are being committed.
A reparations program was created to reconcile the wrongs of the past and formalise settlement agreements between the state and the Maori people.
Settlement processes have contributed to empowering Māori in a big way.
We're relatively now a wealthy tribe with net settlement assets of close to 1.6 billion and rising.
They've been able to give them an economic opportunity to start developing something that we would never been able to before.
So are New Zealand's settlement agreements an example of how best to tackle historical grievances?
There are no easy answers in the search for that elusive concept known as justice, so long after the event.
The islands in the southwest Pacific, now known as New Zealand, were once inhabited only by the Maori. They formed tribes and sub-tribes known as iwi and hapu. As the tentacles of Western imperialism spread around the world in the 18th century, white settlers landed in what was then called Aotearoa, looking for resources to exploit. By the start of the 19th century, it was like the Wild West.
A lot of them were sealers and whalers. It was just debauchery all over the place, drunkenness, murder. Every non-civilized behavior was there. Our ancestors became increasingly frustrated that they could not get these people to abide by the laws of the country.
In 1840, the British made an agreement with over 500 Maori chiefs that would forever define their relationship. The Treaty of Waitangi.
The treaty that was entered into in 1840 was to give over responsibility from our leaders here to the British leader, who at that time was Queen Victoria.
In addition, Maori chiefs thought the treaty would give them more say on trade and land sales. But the language of the treaty is contentious. Two versions, one Maori, one English, didn't help. The Maori copy promised they would continue to own their lands, forests and fisheries. The English version gave the Queen all the rights and powers of sovereignty over their land. In the Maori language, there isn't a direct translation for the word sovereignty, because there was no singular ruler over the land. The British government insisted the treaty placed the Maori under British authority.
In our culture, if you want to include people in the culture, you give them over land so that they will become part of you. Well, the British misinterpreted that as being that we had sold our lands to them and given everything up, which simply just wasn't true.
There was a great deal of land initially for settlement, and the Crown acquired it mostly through purchasing, but the purchases were forced purchases basically, and the promises made to Māori were essentially broken. And then when that land started to run out, then the Crown invaded areas that were resisting. So essentially we have typical colonization procedures to alienate Māori land and to marginalise Maori culture and to try and assimilate Maori into the Western ways of thinking and seeing and doing.
Wars, Western diseases, poverty. The effects of colonisation decimated the Maori population. Estimates suggest there might have been 100,000 Maori by the end of the 18th century. The 1896 census counted just 42,000. Within a generation, the Maori went from being landlords for the white settlers to being their labourers, and all at the hands of their own government.
It wasn't just resources that they took off us, they tried to destroy us as well as a people. Take away our language, take away our culture, write legislation making them illegal, not allowed to be taught in schools. My father and his generation were all physically punished and psychologically punished if they spoke Maori in schools. That's one of the reasons that we have such difficulty in shifting the status quo, is that the British came out here to seek their fortune in a land that was not their own, and in the process of doing so became very privileged, very wealthy, very powerful, and are not prepared to give that up.
New Zealand used to pride itself on being the country with the best race relations in the world. And from about the 1960s, 1970s onwards, people increasingly challenged that.
After the Second World War, Maori began to migrate to the cities in search of employment and modern life. The speed of this transformation highlighted the gulf between the two sets of people. Maori experienced discrimination in housing and employment, were expected to learn English and abandon their customs. But this new generation of urban Maori would have a huge impact.
Maori in the cities had much more capacity to challenge the Crown and to get the Crown to actually listen to their grievances, particularly younger Maori who were educated and knew how to make their way in the white world, the Pākehā world. Younger Māori were terribly influenced by the protest movements right around the world in the 1960s, including Black Power in America, the American Indian movement. But then the Māori Landmarch in 1975, that was tremendously important at bringing Māori issues to Pākehā attention. And that was a combination of elders, led by a very revered queer female elder, Dame Whina Cooper, and in association with a lot of younger, more radical people.
Suffering with arthritis, 80-year-old Whina Cooper led 5,000 people on a 700-mile march to protest stolen Maori land. This period of cultural and political revival is now known as the Maori Renaissance. It helped unify Maori opinion on land reclamation, and it opened the eyes of white New Zealanders to Maori causes and race more broadly.
You started getting some sort of understanding amongst the general population that things weren't all that good for Maori, and maybe that did explain why Maori were so poor and so not able to keep up with the rest of the country. But there was no understanding of how deliberate and how the bad faith that was involved in what the British did was simply not there.
The same year as the Land March, the New Zealand government launched the Waitangi Tribunal to investigate contemporary breaches of the 1840 treaty. Maori culture was being revitalised and better protected. Huge numbers of New Zealanders also protested the visit of the South African rugby team, who maintained the segregationist policy of apartheid. As both national and international attention increased, the New Zealand government amended the Treaty of Waitangi Act to investigate historical grievances dating back to the Treaty of 1840.
They began to realise that if you have a large Indigenous population that's dissatisfied with fundamental aspects of the way you're running the country and the way you have run it, then the only way forward in a meaningful way is to address their grievances.
By 1985, the tribunal was hearing claims from individual tribes and started making settlements varying in size and substance and offering more than just monetary compensation. Some included formal apologies from the Crown.
The apology was tremendously important for Maori, and the initial tribes we negotiated with, they insisted on an apology, and the Crown was incredibly reluctant to do so. They probably they certainly thought that there might be legal ramifications for that.
Some claims had cultural significance, such as the restoration of Maori names of geographical features. One iwi had so much economic success resulting from its settlement agreement that it became a blueprint for others to follow.
The Ngāi Tahu economic loss, was valued at 20 billion. 20 billion, and we settled on the cash offer of the 170 million.
The Ngāi Tahu land in the South Island, which is equivalent in size to the state of New York, was taken by the British for just £14,750.
Our people were split. There were those who did not want to settle because the quantum, the value that we were settling for was significantly less than what the assessment of what the value should have been.
Despite the discrepancy in value, the Ngāi Tahu have built a successful portfolio and intergenerational wealth through savvy investment. As of May 2019, Ngāi Tahu's fund boasts an average annual return of more than 15%, according to the iwi's investment arm.
We're relatively now a wealthy tribe with net settlement assets of close to 1.6 billion. Today, Ngāi Tahu has interests in fishing, tourism, property, as well as a diversified equities portfolio, all of which are managed through our Ngāi Tahu Holdings Limited, our commercial company. Structurally, there are two parts to the organisation. So we have one arm that makes the money, and we have another arm that spends the money, and we keep them very separate. The settlement at that time was a relief for our people. It meant that our grievances were acknowledged. It meant the wrongdoings of the Crown were acknowledged. It meant that we could finally have redress that could assist us to develop a strong economic base to support our people. And for our elders, the apology part of settlement meant that they felt that our tupuna, our ancestors before us, the wrongdoings had been acknowledged.
Today, we are strong enough and honest enough to learn the lessons of the last 150 years and to admit that the treaty has been imperfectly observed.
Despite wide acceptance of the need for settlement agreements, the process is found wanting from both sides of the divide. Some criticise the increasing number of claims and expense. Many Maori argue settlements don't even begin to scratch the surface of their losses.
The amount that they were offering to settle these claims was minuscule. You know, I'm talking 1% of what was lost, and no consideration at all for the socio-economic damage that had been done. The grinding poverty and the grinding marginalisation, deprivation just became too much for our people, and so they started accepting just a little bit to get themselves up off the grinding poverty. And once they started doing that, the government machine was relentless, and it just drove settlements. And I was one of the negotiators. My iwi decided we would try to see if we could get our lands back, and under the settlement process, it was the most horrific, demoralizing process that I've ever been through. They would come into your iwi, divide your iwi so that you're all fighting each other, and that was the biggest damage that was done, was the internal conflict that it caused. And all of that for the return of 1% of your land.
Settling is also contentious for some Maori who aspire to rangatiratanga, which translates as the right of Maori people to rule themselves. Another issue was how the Crown could give away land. Owners of private land who gained it through legal means cannot have it taken from them. the Crown can only give its own land or money for the tribes to purchase land. It had to offer packages that could never fully compensate the tribes, but were large enough to help them rebuild. They also had to be kept in line with the other tribes, of which there are around 100. Some iwi aren't close to settling either. The claims process is far from perfect and will always attract conflicting views. But what the majority agree is that it offers a roadmap on how to acknowledge events of the past and build for the future.
What extends beyond the negotiating table? That is not the end of our relationship, nor is it the end of the Crown's responsibility. It's the fact that not everyone has a decent home, a decent place to live, and it's the incarceration of the Maori people disproportionately to everyone else. That is the distance between us. And so long as that exists, we have failed in our partnership. But I inherently believe in our power to change.
I look back to the time before treaty settlements, when Māori were in despair of getting anything much at all out of the Crown, any kind of respect for rangatiratanga, and where Pākehā thought that we had perfect race relations, there wasn't much of a problem. I think most New Zealanders of European descent wouldn't think that now at all. They know that there was a typical colonial past for New Zealand and that Māori were disenfranchised and disadvantaged and marginalised.
While systemic issues remain in New Zealand, settlements have revitalised communities, increased intergenerational wealth, and reconciled differences. The Maori economy is now worth almost 70 billion New Zealand dollars. That's up from an estimated 50 billion in 2013.
I don't want to kind of leave it with too rosy a view, but I do think that we have made enormous progress and we're on quite a good platform for better progress still.